Welcome to the New Hampshire Journal podcast. I'm your host, Michael Graham, managing editor at NHJournal.com. Thank you all for listening to the podcast and sharing it with your friends. Thank you to our good friends at Perfect Smiles for sponsoring it. More about that coming up. And by the way, I just got to warn you, after this conversation, our ranked punditry figure features Dave Carney, who as always is off the hook. Not necessarily family friendly. You've been forewarned. However, always family friendly is Frank Guinta, former congressman from the Granite State. Welcome to the podcast for the first time, Congressman.
Michael, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we love having political celebrities and also people who are trivia pursuit questions. The last Republican to win a federal race in New Hampshire was?
That would be Frank Guinta.
In 2014.
Yep.
So I just want to ask you, just big picture speaking, about New Hampshire and partisanship. How is the state different from a Republican-Democrat viewpoint than it was back in the days when you and your Democratic colleague were swapping the seat back and forth?
Well, look, we always had contested races. That being said, when I served in Congress, I worked with Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, on issues that mattered to New Hampshire. And I'd like to think that people who represent our state do want to look at two things. One, what is in the best interest of the state and then in the country? And I think New Hampshire voters want that, and New Hampshire constituents want that. So, I always tried to work with whoever I served with. The delegation that I served with was both Charlie Bass and Annie Custer. I worked well with both of them. I'm friends with both of them to this day. When I served with then President Barack Obama, I was fortunate to get 8 bills signed into law by the president, despite the fact that he and I had very different viewpoints on larger issues.
But and that's the fascinating part about working together across the aisle. But this is my common experience at New Hampshire Journal. Well, someone will say, well, the first congressional district is so close. It's such a swingy seat. And I'm like, what are you talking about, swingy?
It hasn't been.
And they said, well, it went back and forth. They said, yeah, Frank Guinta and Carol Shea Porter, but it's been since 2014 that a Republican carried. It's a full decade without a Republican victory. Why do you think that is?
Well, look, I think you do have to give credit to the person who currently holds the seat and has focused his time and energy on constituent service, which is something that's important in New Hampshire.
Right.
I get along with Chris Pappas. I've known him for a long time, going back to his days as chairman of the Manchester Democratic Committee and when I was mayor of Manchester. And I think secondly, not just that seat, but all seats require quality candidates. You cannot underestimate the importance of a quality candidate. We need to, as a party in New Hampshire, continue to focus on cultivating candidates at all levels, not just at the federal level.
Right.
And I'm talking not just state representative and state senator. We need to cultivate at the extreme local level to see who bubbles up to the top as quality candidates. And I think we need to do a better job of that in our state.
I want to ask you more about that and the concept of productive losses in just a minute. But I want to go back to the short answer that you usually get when you say what happened to New Hampshire, which used to have, Jeb Bradley's and Frank Guinta's, and now those days long gone, is the National Party. That just as the National Party has turned the South and parts of the Midwest and the old Iron Rust Belt more red, that same transition to a more populist, blue collar party has caused blue areas like New England to turn more blue, and that it's a national party brand. People are Governor Sununu, sure. Governor Ayotte, sure. Wait, federal? No. I'm not sending those Republican jerks in D.C. any friends. Is that a fair assessment in your opinion?
I think it is. The issues have been very nationalized, and that's for a number of reasons. First, the way we receive our news, or what we call news these days, people will watch one channel as opposed to a myriad of channels and trying to get a broad view of issues. The news is delivered very differently from those channels.
Right.
So local, your podcast, for example, is important because you can delve down into an issue that is relevant to New Hampshire, and you don't have to be partisan about it. You can ask tough questions of both sides of the aisle. So I do think that issues have been nationalized. When it comes to New Hampshire, there are unique issues at a federal level that only affect New Hampshire that we need to accentuate and talk more about. We have a port that is
Right.
incredibly important from a transportation standpoint. We have LIHEAP issues and SNAP issues that are unique to New Hampshire because of the topography and the
Right.
geographic location. Those are different. And we even have forestry that's important to New Hampshire that you wouldn't think of, and dairy and farming that wouldn't be thought of as a local issue. But we need to talk more about those issues as candidates and as members of a delegation.
So you mentioned earlier about building a farm team, if you will.
Mm.
And you could make the argument that the party that's really suffering from the farm team standpoint is the Democratic Party. I mean, the candidates they've had for governor the last few cycles have just not been great. And they've had a couple that you'd think, well, the Senate leader, Dan Feltus, at least on paper, looked good. Obviously, he didn't perform well, but it's been former office holders and people who lost their primary 2 years before. So clearly Democrats have a problem too. But at the federal level, you just made the case that people say, wow, you'd think we'd have a stronger bench for Republicans. For example, a Johnny Sununu is the kind of candidate you want, whether he's good or bad. The point is he's got experience, he's been there, and that he stands out for being that
Yes,
kind of experience. And I say one of the reasons is because you can't point to very many productive losses. That is, you run for first congressional district and then you learn lessons from losing. So you come back and you win and you run again and maybe you win again. I think Holly Noveletsky, for example, is a stronger candidate this time than she was 2 years ago. Her
I agree.
message is more focused because she ran before. But have you noticed how rare? I mean, that's what
Yeah.
makes you stand out. You ran, you won, you lost, so you kept in there fighting. And it seems to be like we're a state full of one and done candidates
Well,
on
Michael,
both sides.
look, people talk about, someone's a lifelong politician, but I had
Right.
experience. I started as a state representative, and then I was a city alderman in Manchester. And I think that those years were formative in terms of, for me, in terms of
Sure.
learning the issues, learning how to deal with people, learning how to work on both sides of the aisle. Some of the closest friends that I established in the political world were people that I served with in the state legislature, and I learned from those people. So, experience is not a bad thing. When you look at the candidates for CD1 over the last several years, more often than not, you're seeing people that didn't have substantive
Right.
policy experience or policy depth or weren't well known to the entire electorate. So we have to do a better job in all facets of that. Having experience is okay. Only in politics would someone make the argument that that person has too much experience.
Exactly.
When you're a CEO of a company, you want someone with deep experience to turn that company around. Well, I look
Uh,
at what we need in our party as a turnaround
right.
as it relates to the federal delegation in New Hampshire. So we need good quality experienced candidates who know how to who have substance on issues,
Right.
but can work with the other side of the aisle and gain that trust from a bipartisan group of constituents.
So if you got a phone call from a Republican who was running for federal office in New Hampshire and they asked you, how should I answer the Trump question? What would your advice be?
Well, I've talked to all the candidates, and we
Oh,
have a
okay.
good crop of candidates in CD1. What I say, first of all, is be honest.
Mhm.
You need to know where you stand, and you need to stick with that. People get a sense pretty quickly
That's
if
right.
you're trying to fake it. They
Yep.
really do. I mean, we have smart voters in New Hampshire. It's one of the unique parts of New Hampshire and New Hampshire politics. It's why we have and place so much stock in the first of the nation primary, which increasingly, unfortunately, is more at stake these days,
Right.
and that needs to be part of the conversation, both on the Republican side and the Democrat side. But the first thing I say is be honest. Secondly, there is a way to communicate with the president and not get on his bad side, and I think that's important. You can be respectful of the president. You can have different views than the president, but I think it's important to let people know that when I differ with the president, I'm going to have a conversation with the president
Mhm.
in a very respectful way and try to promote the issue that is important to New Hampshire. And I think when I have talked to President Trump, he respects that. He wants to have a dialogue with
Right.
you, but you need to you can't be fearful of that.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are,
Sure.
unfortunately. And I understand that it's an awesome office and an awesome responsibility that he holds. And he, has a
Right.
very unique persona. But that's what I tell people: be honest, don't be afraid to have a conversation, and give the point of view from New Hampshire, which is your first responsibility as a member of Congress to your state.
So, what is an area where the federal delegation should be doing more for the state of New Hampshire, in your opinion? What's an issue that they aren't advancing or a policy that they should prevail on?
Well, look, affordability right now, generally speaking, for the country and for New Hampshire is an issue. And when I think of affordability in New Hampshire, I think of, home heating oil, because
Right.
most of us do have home heating oil, myself included.
Hmm.
Gas prices, because most of us have to travel to go to
Sure.
work. Food prices, because we want to feed our family. And then what is the capability or ability for myself to make more money in the
Right.
position that I have. And so those four things to me are critical. We need to be advancing an agenda on a national level that can impact those things, and work with our governor and our state legislature,
Mhm.
because that's complementary too. It's not only federal policy; it's local policy
Right.
too. Property taxes, obviously, as you know, is a significant
Sure.
issue in New Hampshire. How we spend our state-based resources, but those are the policies that we should be advancing. And then there's specific things.
Mhm.
Transportation is critical, and we have transportation infrastructure needs that have to be enhanced. We do, have different areas of New Hampshire. The southern part is very different than the northern
Sure.
part, and there are different needs.
Mhm.
So we need to be focusing on those needs and delivering on constituent
Right.
services and constituent obligations.
So you've represented the first CD, and we obviously the map has been a fight in the past. There's going to be a map, in the
Mm,
future, because Governor Ayotte is just not going to go along with
mm,
this random decade map redrawing. My argument is that the best map that I've seen is, some people call it the I-93 corridor map. I call it the suburbs versus rural map,
mm.
which is, you should take all those areas like from Salem up to Manchester River, where you've got people who are, a lot of them commuting into Mass, but it's a lot of people who are, homes versus homes and apartments, but it's more densely populated, and it's more of that, commuter crew. And then take the rest of the state from the seacoast all the way up, that has a more, let's face it, vacation and outdoors. I'm saying, because that, to me, that's the, given you're only going to have two seats and you can't micro slice,
Right.
that's the two states. You've got a state that very much relies on outdoor activity and tourism and that kind of thing. The incomes tend to be lower for all sorts of reasons. Then you have the more high income suburban white collar part of New Hampshire. That's where I draw the line. How would you make a map for the first CD?
Well, I was involved in this when I was in Congress, and since I've been in Congress, since I've been out of Congress, a lot of people have asked my opinion on it. I think it's very simple to draw a map in New Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
It's only two districts.
Right.
The fight has been far more contentious than it should be, unfortunately.
Right.
Um, when I look at CD1, I think of, why is Rockingham County in two different districts?
Good point.
I start with that. That to me would be simple. And we're not like a southern state that has 100 counties.
Exactly.
Our government is different. We do have county government, so it sort of makes sense to try to keep counties together. And then, 93 does sort of split the state to a certain extent. You could create a map that I think is fair, reasonable, respectful of the different constituencies.
Right.
So I wouldn't make many changes, but I think Rockingham County being included in CD1, and you have to shift the lines a little bit to make
Sure.
sure that you have the same number of people roughly within CD1, CD2. And I think the maps that I've talked about that share those lines have bipartisan support. Unfortunately, they just haven't been able to be completed at the
Right.
state legislative level.
Well, so, to be perfectly, to throw it down here as we do it, if you want to see a Republican member of Congress again in New Hampshire anytime soon, you're going to have to change the map. That's just the way it is. There's just no way. And that's reality. Just like in Illinois, where they turned the state that's 6% Democrat, 40% Republican into a state whose delegation is 90% Democrat. They want to screw with this is the way the world works. Isn't it time for New Hampshire to draw a map so there's one Republican member of Congress and one Democrat member of Congress?
Well, look, the argument for that is a better reflection of the geography. I mean, right now we have the governor's Republican, the state legislature is Republican, and the federal delegation is Democrat, and that's been going on now for some time.
Yep.
I can make an argument that the better the quality candidate, they can overcome some of the party registration challenges within CD1, a little more difficult in CD2. That being said, there are other factors that are national that
Right.
should not affect the voting population, but they do. We're human,
Sure,
it's
of course.
human nature. So whether we like it or not, presidents, whether it's this president or when it was Joe Biden,
Right.
that has a way of impacting the midterm elections. Whether it should or shouldn't,
Right.
that's another question, another debate. But I think we have the capability of winning with quality candidates. That being said, redistricting is long overdue. And I think there's a way to redistrict that is respectful of both parties and party registration.
So let's wrap up at the highest level of punditry, which is the U.S. presidential race. As we're speaking, the DNC is in the process of voting to kill the first in the nation primary again. So let's start with brief with that. My theory is that the Democrats really screwed up 4 years ago by not fighting it. I mean, I just think about I won't speak for you, Congressman, but if I had been a U.S. Senator and my party had a one vote majority and they were trying to take away the first, nothing would get through the Senate until that got fixed.
I agree with you.
The fact that Shaheen and Hassan didn't do that, I mean, I know they're friends of yours. Having lived in many places, many campaigns, we have a very unimpressive federal delegation from a standpoint of actually getting things done, of having any influence. I mean, you think about Manchin or look at my home state, South Carolina. Why was Lindsey Graham a big wheel? It's not a big state.
Right.
It's not a wealthy state. He used his power and he mattered. And this group of nobodies that you pulled out of a phone book for New Hampshire, it's just embarrassing. They just don't matter. And you're watching it right now. How important do you think is the First in the Nation primary to the state of New Hampshire overall, in your opinion?
It's incredibly important, not just to the state of New Hampshire, but to small states around the country, and sending a message that small states matter. And people will say, they'll question me from other states on this, and I said, look, don't tell me that a presidential candidate is going to campaign the same way in California, Texas, and Florida that they do in Iowa and New Hampshire. And for that reason alone, you want to be able to, in our country and our democracy and our republic, to be able to speak to your candidates, and you can only do that the way New Hampshire allows it. So it is incredibly important. Secondly, on your point, I'm friends with the delegation. I have differences with this delegation. And on First in the Nation primary, I share your frustration and your anger that our delegation didn't do more. The Senate has extreme power in that the House of Representatives doesn't have. And when it comes up to holding up nominations, holding up legislation because of their Senate rules and the 60 vote requirement, senators from any state, when they feel it's important and critical enough, can hold up legislation. And our democracy was designed, especially by the Senate, to be slower for that purpose. And our delegation should have done far more to preserve and protect the First in the Nation primary. And I expect them to do it this time around.
Not happening. They've already written it off. They're not even talking about it. It's just embarrassing, but whatever. So let me ask you a historic question. You've watched a lot of people in both parties campaign here in the unique on the ground First Nation style. Who are one or two of the best New Hampshire candidates that you saw running for president? Whether they ended up getting the nomination or not, you thought, wow, that person really gets how to campaign in New Hampshire.
Oh, that's a great question.
Everyone says Bill Clinton because he kind of rescued his candidacy by coming in second here, and
Well, he's unique in the sense that he just had a personality
right,
that worked in retail politics. So he enjoyed it. He was not a rope line kind of guy. And we've seen rope line
sure,
candidates that are not successful in New Hampshire. And then you see candidates that can talk to people one on one and enjoy it. Bill Clinton was certainly that. On the Republican side, George Bush was that way. I mean, when he first came up to New Hampshire, this George Bush, the son,
that's not right.
he came up and he spent time with individuals, and he was able to capture sort of a one-on-one connectivity with people. If you're looking at who is capable of doing that in the future on the Republican side, I think somebody who has run before, who has now gained more experience, who, if he decides to run and comes back to New Hampshire, is someone like Marco Rubio,
Mm-hmm.
who has a lot more experience, has gone through it that first time, and has a personality that is much more connective today than it was when he ran the first time.
How do you think JD Vance will do in New Hampshire in retail politics?
I think he'll do okay. There's a lot of responsibility on him and expectations on him that we only will know how he fares once he comes up and spends time as a candidate for president,
Right.
assuming he decides to run. It's different when you're on the ticket, and it's especially different when you're on the ticket with President Trump.
Right.
I mean, he's just the
Exactly.
person in the room that.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see JD Vance and how he tries to define himself as a
Right.
candidate outside of being on the Trump ticket.
And one last question. Were you surprised to see AOC topping the UNH latest survey for Democrats' choice? Given,
No.
once again, you represented a swing district. What the heck?
Because so I was not surprised. I don't think she would ever be the nominee. And candidly, I think that she's probably scared to death of that poll, because she's clearly not ready for that stage.
Okay.
But I wasn't surprised because the Democratic Party is very fractured in terms of what direction it's going to go policy-wise. And just like in any primary process, the far, far left, I think what they're calling it now is Democratic Socialists,
Sure.
and apparently there are more in New Hampshire than we were aware of, are looking for that type of candidate with that type of policy. So because of that, it doesn't surprise me. Now, if she decides to come to New Hampshire and spend time there, I think you'd see those numbers shift.
And last question is, of the people who are being talked about, who are the one or two Democrats that you've got your eye on as saying they could probably do pretty well in New Hampshire?
Well, I tend to look at governors because they have that executive experience, and all of them have pros and cons. Sure. But I would look at, I would probably look at the governor of Pennsylvania and see how he does. He's got his detractors.
Dude, my lovely bride, Buttercup, a nice Jewish girl from the suburbs of Cleveland. She'll tell you right now, it ain't going to be Shapiro or Emmanuel. Probably not even Ossoff.
For other reasons.
Yes,
other reasons. But if you're talking about who can, be competitive from a policy standpoint in New Hampshire, the way he communicate. Now, obviously, there are other issues that people tend to consider. But when it comes to a policy standpoint, how he's tried to govern in Pennsylvania, that could be applicable. It's hard to look at it in a vacuum because you've got to look at how many candidates there are going to be.
What about Gavin Newsom?
I don't think he's going to fare well. I think he's got too many problems. I think he comes across almost as too wanting the presidency.
Right.
He claims that he doesn't want it, but we all know that that's not true.
Exactly.
And I think the way he's governed California, Democrats can point out two specific facts. Number one, the cost per person to run the state of California since you've been governor. And secondly, the number of people that have left California.
Right.
Those are two glaring problems for any governor.
Listen, it's been terrific to have you on the podcast. Finally, Congressman Frank Guinta, thanks so much. By the way, before I let you go, mutual friend of ours, J. Mark Powell. I have his book right here.
I saw it. It's
texted a terrific book, Witness to War. He writes our Holy Cow history columns, does a great job, and I had to give him a shout out.
I have it too. He's a great guy. I texted him right before I get on with you, and he said to say hi.
Excellent. Well, hi to all of our listeners, and thank you, Congressman Guinta, again for joining us here on the New Hampshire Journal podcast.
My pleasure.